Fall camp is just days away, folks. In Coral Gables, we got Brad Tejeda here from Canes Insight to break it all down for us. Brad, appreciate you being here, man.
No problem, man. Appreciate you again for letting me talk some Canes football with the Canes community, man. Thank you for having me.
All right. I'm the nerd out there that wants to know everything about everyone. So we love the personnel breakdown. So we'll get to the nuts and bolts, folks. We're going to lean on Brad here for an offensive breakdown position by position. Start at quarterback. Tyler Van Dyke, of course, had that amazing 8-9 game breakout in 2021, where he was arguably the best quarterback in the country for about 2 months. Last year, we could much debate as to whether he really decreased in regards to his production personally. Of course, the offensive line, the receivers let him down. And then the injuries, of course, is going to affect anyone. So your thoughts about TVD bouncing back after 10 touchdowns and 5 picks last year?
Yeah, with Tyler Van Dyke, there's a lot to unfold with someone like him, right? You first and foremost, you talk a lot about the productivity, which is what everyone looks for in a quarterback, right? And I think the biggest difference you saw from last year to 2021, not just the wins total on the season, but you also got to look at the stats a little bit more deeper, right? You had the same, you pretty much had the same completion percentage from last year to the year prior. Maybe I think it was from 63 to 62%. Like you mentioned, he only had 10 touchdowns, 5 interceptions last year, but the year prior with Rhett Lashley, I think he had like 25 touchdowns and 6 interceptions, had 1,000 passing yards more than what he did have last year. And there was only a 1-game difference. So it wasn't like he wasn't playing in a lot less games, but yet the productivity was significantly different. And when you really look at that, Mark, you really have to look at the offensive coordinator as well. Having a guy like Rhett Lashley 2 years ago, it was someone that he was a lot more similar with as far as game style. It was someone that kind of gave him the reins, the control as a quarterback, right? If you're the main guy in charge, you're calling the audibles, you're calling the plays at the line of scrimmage. You need to have full control when things break down or when you want to call that audible. And those were things that a guy like Rhett Lashley definitely allowed Tyler Van Dyke to have. Now, when you fast forward to this last season with Josh Gaddis, Burrow's Award winner, he didn't really fit the same play style of a guy like Tyler Van Dyke. Not to mention, he didn't really give him the necessarily reins to have that control as a quarterback last year. Between the relationship that you have, not only with your offensive coordinator, but then having another guy in between it as your quarterback coach, and Frank Ponce, who again was another guy that had his hand in the mix and wasn't necessarily on the same page as your offensive coordinator. You start to throw a couple more, curveballs into the mix as a starting quarterback in college football. Either way, you still got to get it done. And between, the injuries, like you said, and just him not being able to perform on a week-to-week basis, you saw a young man in Jakari Brown who came in for, I believe, 5 games last year. Wasn't able to keep that red shirt last year. Had one big game against Georgia Tech where he had 3 touchdowns, really took control of that football game. But I look for this football season, as far as the quarterback room, I look for someone like Jakari Brown to hopefully be able to redshirt this year, because he's already came out and said point blank, hey, I would love to redshirt this year. I think I need another year to really learn the system and just the control and what college football is. And I think this is the year for Tyler Van Dyke to really take control of not only the offense, but control of his destiny. If he wants to be an NFL quarterback, this is going to be his money year to really just prove it to everyone, including himself, that he can be a Sunday quarterback. And he's got a lot of pressure on him, not only because of how he performed last year, but also, some of the things that was going on off the football field going into this football season. There were some talks about, between his agent and another school of creating that leverage of possibly leaving the program of Miami and hitting the transfer portal and going to another program over in Alabama. But that was something that obviously ended up not happening. So Tyler Van Dyke has a lot of eyes on him, whether it's the fan base, whether it's the NFL scouts, or just, all the haters that don't like him as well. But I think this is a make or break year for Tyler Van Dyke. He's going to have to perform in order for this football team to perform this year.
Brad, you bring up the importance of the offensive coordinator, and that's the case everywhere, but specifically to TVD and his development and him having to work under 3 different coordinators. And now Shannon Dawson, impressive resume elsewhere, based not just on the numbers, but everything that you can put together about his background. Are you optimistic that he gets TVD back on track?
Oh, absolutely. Just because first and foremost, he's very similar to Rhett Lashley. He's very quarterback innovative. The relationship that you're already seeing between Shannon Dawson and Tyler Van Dyke seems to be night and day from what he's had from Josh Gaddis and Frank Ponce last year. And again, it's an offensive coordinator that understands that the quarterback needs a lot of control in the offense, which he's being able to do again this football season. And he just feels a lot more comfortable when you're able to listen to Tyler Van Dyke speak in interviews and just talking to him as well. You know, these are just things where you can just tell this football season he seems a little bit more relaxed, not having to overthink a lot. That was his problem last year. He was overthinking way too much, whether it was his receivers or just trusting himself at the line of scrimmage. And those are things that I think is going to get fixed this year.
Jake Garcia off to Missouri. Is it Jakari Brown, no doubt, as the backup, or is there a battle there?
You know, I think it's got to be Jakari Brown as the backup. I think Emory Williams, when you look at him on the practice field, he fits right in this quarterback room. He actually towers over Jakari Brown. He's actually probably the biggest stature-wise in the quarterback room already as a true freshman. And as crazy as it sounds, he's probably the most accurate quarterback in our quarterback room right now is probably Emory Williams. But I do think, you know, he needs at least a year to kind of just get familiar with college football, understanding the game speed. And this will be a great opportunity for him to do that. But I would expect Tyler Van Dyke to hopefully play all year this year, perform very well, and still allow someone like Jakari Brown to play 4 games this year and still be able to keep that red shirt.
Canes Insight, folks, get there. Breaking down Miami football on a daily basis. Brad does a tremendous job, and everybody else, especially with the recruiting being front and center here during the summer as we lead into fall camp. And of course, the focus goes to the field here very soon, but the recruiting in particular, the interviews, the contacts that they have is remarkable. So we've got to get there on a regular basis. Let's look at the running backs, Brad, because when I look at the talent there and the talent going into last season, you would think that they would have to have a million injuries for it to affect this running back room, but it definitely did. Henry Parrish comes back, most productive back from Ole Miss. Mark Fletcher comes in as one of the top running backs in all of college football. Trevante Citizen, we want to see what he can do as one of the best running backs in the 22 class. It's loaded. A.J. Allen, a transfer coming in from Nebraska, got his feet wet there with the Huskers. And maybe the biggest addition in some ways would be Tim Harrison leading the group coming in from UCF, where he had a top 10 rushing attack there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, first and foremost, before we even talk about the players in the room, I mean, there was a lot of turnover on this football team, whether it was the players or the staff members. And this is another position group that's going to have a new face at the coaching position, right? And Tim Harris Jr., you know, formerly, you know, from South Florida as well, as we all know. So the recruiting was something that, you know, is going to be something very smooth for this football program. So the recruiting aspect, you're not going to have to worry too much with Tim Harris. But then when you talk about the player development, you do have some guys in there. But when you look at this running back room, it's loaded from a talent standpoint. But then when you look closely at the productivity, Mark, that's where it gets a little bit interesting, right? The number one running back in this room, you know, this year coming up is actually a guy that has only played 3 games in the last 2 years, and that's Don Chaney Jr. From Berlin Jesuit. He is finally healthy for the first time in his career at the University of Miami. Full offseason healthy, had full go. He looks better than ever. He's someone that when you talk to players on the team, when you talk to staff or just anyone around the program, he's someone where they are asking him to kind of slow it down because he's just running over everybody. He's been anxious to get back on the football field. Again, like I said, he hasn't been healthy his whole career. This is going to be his opportunity to really show that he can play on Sundays as well. He's in a very similar position to Tyler Van Dyke, as we know in the running back room, just as the position, the longevity at a running back is very slim, especially on Sundays, right? Your window is about 5 to 6 years. And if you're already going through injuries, you know, it starts to get slimmer. And someone in Don Chaney, he has the stature and the ability to play on Sundays, but he has already battled so many injuries where this is going to be his kind of make or break year to show that he can kind of get drafted in the NFL. Even though he has 2 more years of eligibility, I think this is going to be the year to showcase his talent. He's going to be relied on very heavily this year, in my opinion. So that's going to be the number one running back in our room. But then you got guys that could complement him. I think Henry Parrish is the perfect running back too in any running back room. I think our problem last year was we had to rely on him at being that running back one, and he's just not necessarily that type of guy that you need to give, the 15 to 20 carries for. And not to mention that the play style of gameplay of the offensive play calling that we were running last year compared to how it's going to be this year is really going to suit someone like Henry Parrish, who is coming from a more Ole Miss play styling, play calling, which is going to be very similar to how we're going to be running it this year. So I expect someone like Henry Parrish to kind of go right from last year to this year, and maybe productivity go up even more. So he should be a great complementary too. And then you bring up Ajay Allen, who's a transfer from Nebraska. This is a guy who I actually thought was a great addition because you lose someone in Jalen Rooster, who ended up going to SMU and following Rhett Lashley and a few other players on this team. You lose someone in Rooster, but then you bring in a guy in Ajay Allen, where if you really watch their film, they're very similar type running backs. So their game style and ability to what they bring to the table is really going to fit in just like how Rooster was. In my opinion, he's going to be very motivated and very hungry because he's coming in as a redshirt freshman, only played in 2 or 3 games last year at Nebraska before suffering a knee injury, but really showcased some very bright spots. And I think he's going to be a guy that we don't have to necessarily rely on in this running back room, but he's going to be a guy that's going to be able to showcase his talent all throughout the football season. So he's going to be a great addition. And then you can't forget the 2 freshmen that we brought in this year, right? Mark Fletcher, first and foremost, coming from American Heritage. It's one of the best high schools in the nation over there in Broward County. This is a guy that every school in the nation wanted him. At one point, he was committed to Ohio State. Ended up being a state of Florida battle between Florida and Miami ended up getting him. And there's a big reason why a lot of fans are very excited for this young man. Not only is he a true freshman, but I think he's going to get a lot of playing time this year just because of what he's going to bring to the table. He's someone in the running back room that is a lot different from the rest just because of his size and what he brings to the football field. This is a young man as a true freshman. He's already 6'2", 225 pounds. So he's ready to go. He's, college football ready. And he's a ground and pound type of running back, and he could also catch out the backfield. So he's going to bring a lot of diversity to the football field, and he's going to create mixed matches as soon as he gets comfortable in this college football atmosphere. And then you also got in Chris Johnson Jr. I don't expect him to play much this year. He's going to be more of a speed guy. You may see him on, kick return, punt return. Hopefully only play 4 games this year and be able to redshirt. But he's a guy. He's a track guy. I believe he ran 100-meter in like 10.45 in the 100, which is one of the fastest in the nation. So you talk about speed. That's something you're definitely going to want in a Shannon Dawson offense.
Ajay Allen, Mark. Ajay, not AJ Allen. We cover Nebraska football. No, that was me needing the correction there. Brad, thank you so much for that because we cover Nebraska football. I got a ton of names in my head, but it's been a few months, so I forgot. Ajay Allen coming in from the Huskers. All right, Canes Insight. Get there on a regular basis. Check out Brad's work. Again, it's everything you want for Miami football coverage. You would think wide receivers, even if the team was down, the program was down, wide receiver should be an automatic at Miami with all the speed in that part of the country. But it was down. Colby Young, correct me if I'm wrong. I thought he was the most consistent guy on the outside, 32 catches, 5 touchdowns. Tyler Harrell has already produced in this league at Louisville, took a pit stop at Alabama last year. Your thoughts about the wide receivers getting better?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, again, new coach at that position group as well. Your offensive coordinator last year, and Josh Gaddis was also the wide receivers coach. So it wasn't getting as much attention and love as it should have. You bring in another local guy in Kevin Beard, who was on that championship team over at Miami, played with Santana Moss, played with Andre Johnson, played with some of the greatest wide receivers to ever come out of University of Miami, and also played on Sundays. So he knows exactly what it looks like to go to the next level. And he's a guy that's very player relatable. The players really love him. They trust him. He's someone that is very hands-on as far as a route technician. He's going to be able to bring this wide receiver room to a new level, in my opinion. This should be the best wide receiver room that we've had in some few years. That's not very hard to say, unfortunately, just because the wide receiver room as a whole hasn't really been the best, Mark. Unfortunately, our best wide receivers in years past have been transfer portal guys, whether it's KJ Osborne, Charleston Rambo, Colby Young last year, right? These are all transfer portal guys. And when you look at this year, you mentioned Colby Young again, which is a transfer guy from last year. And then you brought up Tyler Harrell, who's, again, another transfer portal guy. And, when you talk about the Shannon Dawson offense, the first thing he talked about was making the home run plays. We're going to have to create big play opportunities and throw deep. And in order to do that, you have to get guys that could create space, create leverage, and be able to keep the defense on their toes. And that's why you bring in a guy like Tyler Harrell, who has that 4.24 40-yard dash speed that you're going to want on this football team. Like you mentioned before, transfer from Louisville, then to Alabama, and now to Miami. This is now his third program. Three big programs that all produce NFL talent. So in my opinion, at this point, this is a lot of pressure on someone like Tyler Harrell to perform well on and off the football field. Because if he wants to play on Sundays, this is kind of his last opportunity to get the job done. And I expect him to do very big things in this offense just because of what I just mentioned on Shannon Dawson and what he, how he creates big plays. Tyler Harrell is going to be the guy to do it, in my opinion. Between him and an upcoming freshman and Ray Joseph, who we added in, those are going to be the two guys that are going to be the home run threats. You also brought in a JUCO transfer in Shamar Kirk, who I expect to not only play this year, but he's going to be able to create a lot of competition with someone like Jacoby George, who needs to step up in this wide receiver room. He's been a local guy, from Plantation, that a lot of Miami fans locally have really wanted to be that guy for the University of Miami and kind of carry the torch. And not only the fans, but the coaches have been, kind of putting emphasis on him to perform well this year. And I expect him to do really good things in this offense as well. So between Jacoby George, Colby Young, and Xavier Restrepo, who's coming off an injury this past year, those should be your three guys, along with Tyler Harrell and Shamar Kirk battling those guys from the transfer portal. And then, like I mentioned before, you got some young up-and-coming guys in Ray Joseph and Robbie Washington who bring a lot of speed and athleticism. You should see him in special teams as well. And then you also got guys like Isaiah Horton and Brashard Smith. Those are two guys that were on the football team last year. That those two in particular, I think we brought in a lot of other guys, whether it's the transfer portal guys or the true freshman guys, that are going to create a lot of attention on those two names to perform. Because if they don't, their snaps are going to get taken from these other guys.
Will Mallory takes his 42 catches to the NFL to try to make it there. Jaleel Skinner's a bit of a freak. He could be a star someday. And of course, Elijah Arroyo got off to a good start in his Miami career before he hit some injury issues.
Yeah, the tight end room, again, we changed tight end coaches, even though the new tight end coach was someone already on staff. They kind of swapped roles. We had Coach Field last year as the tight end coach. This year, we have our guy, Coach Woodle, who's now the tight end coach this year, who was in charge of, part of recruiting last year. And now Coach Field has taken over the recruiting role, and Coach Woodle is now the tight ends coach. And he's doing a lot of great things on the recruiting trail right now for us. But as far as on the football field, he's got a nice position group ahead. When you look at the overall size, and we'll talk about this on the offensive line group here in a little bit as well, but just from a measurable standpoint, the tight end room looks the part. All these guys that we're about to name are around that 6'5", 6'6", 6'7", 215 to 230 range. So what it looks like to have those NFL Sunday tight ends, this is exactly what it's starting to look like at Miami. Miami's always known to being tight end you from all the great tight ends that we've put in the NFL. And it's starting to, create a domino effect from the recruiting aspect of the guys we're bringing in. But first and foremost, you got Elijah Arroyo, who's coming off an injury last year. I expect him to be tight end one this year. He's 6'4", almost 6'5", going to be that guy that I think is going to be able to create a lot of different mismatches on this football field. You lost two tight ends as well on this football team, and Dominic Mammarelli and also Khalil Brantley, a Miami Northwestern guy. Both of those guys ended up transferring from the program in the last few months. So you lose those two guys. You bring in McCormick, Oregon transfer, who I believe this is his 7th or 8th year in college football. But you're going to be bringing him in more for just running, blocking opportunities. So having someone like him will be able to be used in those fronts. But then you got Elijah Royal, Jaleel Skinner, and Riley Williams. Those three in particular are going to be the three-headed monster in the tight end room this year, as far as from a playmaking ability and what they're going to be able to do in the passing game. Like I mentioned before, Cam McCormick is going to be more of just a running game guy. He can obviously catch the football, but I would look for him more on running opportunities. But Riley Williams, who's a true freshman, who we ended up getting from IMG this past cycle, that's going to be a guy as a true freshman. He already looks the part again. He's someone that I believe is 6'5", 6'6", 230 range already. So he already looks the part, can bring a lot to the table. When you talk about a tight end that could stretch the football field and catch in space, that's exactly what you want in a Shannon Dawson offense, and he's going to be a guy that can do that. I feel like Jaleel Skinner is going to be more of a wide receiver than a tight end, in my opinion. I think he needs to be a little bit more sure-handed. I want to see how he performs this year, but I think we got other guys, like we mentioned, that could push the room, and it'll give someone like Jackson Carver to really just take a year in this program to really just understand college football, get in the weight room a little bit more. He's another guy that already has the size of measurables, but he hasn't played much football.
Brad Tejeda's here from Canes Insight. Get on over there to Canes Insight. Check out the Canes coverage. Fall camp is here. It's time to get locked on and locked in on Miami football talk as we head toward game number 1 against Miami. Offensive line, when I look at what has plagued this team over the last 4 or 5 years, not necessarily last year, I think wide receiver first and foremost, but over the last 4 or 5 years, I think linebacker, since that Shaq Quarterman group has taken a hit, and we'll get to the defense at a later date. But I think offensive line, now it's gotten better in some regards, but again, another position hit by injuries. But if the center is the quarterback of the offensive line and that anchor, they have to be better with Matt Lee coming in from UCF.
So again, the offensive line, when you talk about a college football program, it starts in the trenches. You have to make sure the offense and the defensive line, first and foremost, is your strong point. And when you hired Mario Cristobal, you bring in Alex Mirabal, you had to think that the offensive line would be priority number 1. They came in and said that immediately. That was priority number 1. You saw this past year 1 in the program, the offensive line really fell down very quickly. Between the injury bug and guys just not being productive, just wasn't there. And when you look at it from a measurable standpoint, we only had maybe 2 or 3 guys that you could really depend on a football field. And then they just didn't meet the eye test. We had too many guards that should have been centers. We had too many tackles that should have been guards. And, we only had about 3 or 4 guys on this football team that were bigger than 6'5", hitting that 300 mark, unfortunately, Mark. We really looked like a D2 program or a Bethune-Cookman when it came to the measurables and eye tests as far as the offensive line program. Well, you fast forward to this year, Mark, and it's really changed significantly. Just from a measurable standpoint, you got about 8 to 10 guys on this team now that are touching that 6'5", 6'6", 6'7" range already at the 300 mark. And then from a productivity standpoint, it really stands out. You mentioned Matt Lee. And before we even dive into Matt Lee and the rest of this offensive line, when you look from an overall football program, you would think the quarterback is your number 1 priority, and that's the guy that's going to make or break the football team, right? And I would definitely agree. But when you look at this football team in particular, especially this football season, Mark, I would actually beg to differ that Matt Lee is just important on this offense than Tyler Van Dyke, just because when you look at the productivity that Matt Lee brings, along with who is the guy behind Matt Lee if Matt Lee was to go down this year, the drop-off is very significant when we really dig deep into this offensive line. If there's one position in this offensive line group that I'm a little bit afraid about if someone was to go down, it is the center role, because at the end of the day, he is the quarterback at the offensive line. He is the guy that's going to be hand in hand with your quarterback, and he's going to be getting everybody on the same page. And if Matt Lee goes down, you either have a young up-and-coming guy in Ryan Rodriguez who doesn't have that many starts, or you're going to have to start moving and alternating some guys around and bringing someone in who doesn't necessarily play that center role. which is a big reason why you missed on a guy like Connor Liu this past cycle that ended up going to Auburn. You really wanted to land someone like him to be able to have that depth in center. But you're going to see moving forward in the recruiting aspect, Miami should be able to take care of that. But then diving into this, you talk about Matt Lee, right? Matt Lee had 1,059 snaps last year, Mark. And then he totaled for 2,783 snaps and 36 starts as a center for UCF. So when you talk about the overall total snaps and the total amount of starts that just Matt Lee brings alone to this football program, he actually brings more productivity than anyone on this football team as far as the offensive line. Then when you add in another guy in Javion Cohen coming from Alabama, ended up transferring to Miami at the guard position for us. Javion Cohen accumulated for just under 1,600 snaps at Alabama in the last 2 years. So when you look at an overall total, you're talking about 4,400 snaps between just those two transfers alone that you're bringing from a productivity standpoint on this football team. And those are two day one starters. So you talk about your center and your guard position is already locked down with just under 4,400 total snaps at elite level. Neither one of those guys allowed a sack at their other programs as well. So that's another great stat to know between those two guys. You're bringing back a guy in Zion Nelson who only played one game last year. He's going to be a guy that you don't necessarily have to rely on, but you would hope that he becomes your starting left tackle for this football team this year. You also got a guy in Jalen Rivers who most guys on the team, whether you talk to players or guys on the staff, he's your most versatile offensive lineman on the team. He's the guy that could pretty much play anywhere on the offensive line. He is going to be the kind of guy that can go from the left tackle to the guard or even to the center spot if we need it. And then you also bring in, you got some true freshmen as well. Francis Maigoa, Samson Okinola. These were the two top offensive linemen in the country besides, I believe, Hayden Proctor. Caden Proctor was the other top tackle between those two guys. So if you land two of the top three tackles in the nation last year, again, I talked about it at the beginning with this offensive line, Mark. Just from a size and measurables standpoint, we just didn't have it. And you talk about Javion Cohen, 6'6" guy. Francis Maigoa, 6'6" guy, 315 pounds. Samson Okinola, 6'6", 330 pounds. You bring in another guy in Tommy Kinsler, who's 6'7", 320 pounds as well. You're bringing back other guys in Inez Cooper and Mike McCoy, who, again, are both 6'6", 300-plus pounds. So you're starting to finally see the quality depth that Mario Cristobal and Alex Mirabal is building and bringing to this program. It's starting to quickly form into an Oregon offensive line, and that's what you like to see. You're starting to look like you're about 8 guys deep on this offensive line group. I think with one more full recruiting staff season with Miami, I think this team can really do some damage in the offensive line group. And now it's going to shift your priority to the defensive line in the trenches when it talks about recruiting, but that'll be for another day.
Yeah, the recruiting rankings obviously measure each player exactly the same, but when you're building an offensive line leaning program and you pick up 2 of the top 3 offensive tackles in the country, and we'll see what their readiness is and how much they need to contribute right away. Any thoughts about that in terms of Maui Goa and Okinola and how much they're going to be needed this fall?
First and foremost, I think Francis Maigoa is going to be your starting right tackle. He will be a day one starter as a true freshman. I think every school in the country wanted this young man, and it was for great reasons. I think no matter where he landed, I think he probably would have ended up being a day one starter. That just goes to show you how good of a talent this young man has. So I think he's going to be a starter. I think someone in Samson Okinola doesn't have to necessarily start right away. He could be someone that I think halfway in this football season, you'll start to get a lot more snaps, hopefully this year. I would love to see him not burn his red shirt this year. That would be great just to get him in 4 games. But he's someone that as the football season goes on, I wouldn't see a problem with him getting more snaps as well, just because from a talent standpoint, what he brings to the table. And even a guy in Tommy Kinsler, as we know, the injury bugs happen. And when injuries do happen, you need someone to step in right away and fill those spots. And unfortunately, our issue last year wasn't necessarily just the productivity standpoint, but that first guy that went down, the next guy that came back up from a size standpoint, it just was a huge drop off. And having someone like Tommy Kinsler as your second or third guy in rotation to come in there, that's not a drop off. I could tell you that right now. He's one of the biggest guys on the football team, and he'll be one of the biggest guys on the football field.
Brad, this was awesome. We appreciate you breaking down the offense. It was an exhaustive breakdown, folks. We hope you appreciate it. Get more at Kane's Insight. Is there anything going on that you've got working right now that you would like to highlight?
No, man, just continue to show some love over at canesinsight.com. We got great forums over there. We're constantly dropping new news. Kane's Insight on YouTube as well. We do great interviews. We had JoJo Trader and a few of the other guys, Chance Robinson on the show, a few weeks ago, and also, some former players. So go ahead and check that out over at Kane's Insight. And just follow me on Twitter at Tejeda Brad for all your most recruiting news and Canes football updates.
Brad, good to see you. Thank you so much for knocking this out for us.
No problem, man. Thank you as always, and go Canes.